Let me be brutally honest. Japan's economy is cracking, and everyone is pretending it is fine. The headlines talk about slow recovery and steady progress. But when you look at what is happening underneath, it is a completely different story. The country is running out of workers, drowning in debt, and watching prices rise faster than paychecks. Young people have stopped believing they will ever own a home, and even Japan's world-famous export engine is starting to sputter. It is the kind of slow-motion collapse that does not make noise until it is too late. And the craziest part? Most people still act like everything is normal. But when you line up the data, the trends, and the reality everyday people are living through, it is clear that Japan is heading into one of its harshest economic eras yet. So let's break down exactly how this is falling apart and why nobody wants to admit it. If you want to understand why Japan's economy is falling apart, you have to start with the demographics, because the numbers are absolutely brutal. As of the most recent national data, Japan's population sits around 124 million people, and roughly 30% of them are age 65 or older. That is the highest share of elderly citizens in the world. To put it into perspective, Japan now has only about 2 working-age people for every 1 elderly person, and that ratio gets worse every single year. The core working-age population, those between 15 and 64, is shrinking fast. Japan's fertility rate is stuck at around 1.3 children per woman, far below the 2.1 needed for a stable population. Even if the birth rate magically doubled overnight, it would take 20+ years for those children to enter the workforce. Meanwhile, deaths keep climbing, and Japan loses hundreds of thousands of people every year. Entire towns are emptying out. Schools are closing because there are not enough students. Businesses shut down simply because there is no one left to take over. The labor market numbers make the situation even clearer. Japan now relies heavily on seniors to keep the economy running. More than 13% of Japan's entire workforce is made up of people aged 65 plus. Think about how extreme that is. 1 out of every 8 workers is past traditional retirement age. And while that slows the decline in total employment, it is not sustainable. You cannot build a long-term economy on a workforce that is aging out of innovation, heavy roles, physically demanding jobs, and leadership pipelines. Japan has tried to compensate by bringing more women into the workforce, and female participation has risen dramatically, climbing into the 70% plus range. But even with those gains, the total pool of available workers is still shrinking. The country is simply losing people faster than it can replace them. This demographic collapse triggers a chain reaction across the entire economy. Fewer workers mean lower total production and weaker GDP growth. An aging society means soaring pension payouts, rising healthcare costs, and massive social welfare spending. Those bills land squarely on the shoulders of a shrinking tax base, putting enormous pressure on younger generations who already feel financially stressed. The psychological impact is just as severe. Young Japanese adults look at these numbers and see a future filled with higher taxes, shrinking opportunities, weaker job security, and a pension system that may not survive by the time they retire. Many are giving up on traditional milestones like homeownership, long-term careers, or starting families because they simply do not believe the system can support them. Japan's shrinking workforce and aging crisis is not a minor issue. It is the root of almost everything going wrong in the economy. You cannot grow when your population is collapsing. You cannot sustain pensions when retirees outnumber workers. And unless Japan makes massive structural changes, these demographic forces will keep dragging the economy deeper into long-term decline. One of Japan's most urgent problems is the combination of extremely high public debt and painfully weak economic growth. This is a deadly economic mix. When your debt keeps rising but your economy doesn't, you're basically digging a hole you'll struggle to get out of. Let's look at the numbers. Japan's public debt is enormous. The debt to GDP ratio is around 232%. That means the government owes more than twice what the entire economy produces in a year. With a number like that, you're living in a world of extreme fiscal vulnerability. You have to borrow just to finance the interest, just to keep the ship afloat. Meanwhile, growth is limping along. For 2025, real GDP growth is projected at about 0.7%, and expectations for 2026 are even lower, around 0.4%. That small growth rate simply cannot generate enough new value to ease the burden of such massive debt. When you're growing at less than 1%, two big issues hit hard. First, there's not enough new economic output to spread the cost of debt across. If GDP grows strongly, you can inflate your way out or find new revenue via growth. But with growth stuck near zero, the only way to manage the debt is either slash spending, raise taxes, or risk inflation. All of these options carry serious downsides. Second, weak growth means private investment falters, consumption doesn't boom, jobs and wages stagnate, and the government's revenue base slows. At the same time, demographic pressures increase. More retirees, fewer workers, rising health and pension costs. So you have demands for spending rising, economic output flat, and debt flowing in to fill the gap. It's a textbook setup for fiscal crisis. What makes this worse is Japan's policy space is limited. With such a high debt burden, any rise in interest rates makes servicing debt far more expensive. The government's options to stimulate the economy are squeezed. Bigger stimulus means more debt, but doing less means stagnation prolongs. It's a vicious cycle. Weak growth causes higher debt burden. Higher debt burden reduces room to invest, grow, and cycle continues. In short, Japan's economy is trapped. The gigantic debt figure of 232% of GDP and the low projected growth rate of about 0.7% in 2025 are not isolated facts. They are signposts of a system under stress. Unless Japan can either dramatically boost growth or reduce its debt burden, or ideally both, the long-term outlook becomes increasingly precarious. One of the quietest but most damaging problems inside Japan's economy right now is the gap between how fast prices are rising and how slowly wages are moving. Inflation has pushed everyday costs higher across the board, but paychecks simply haven't kept up. That means real wages, what people can actually buy with their income, are falling. And when real wages fall, a country's living standards fall with them. Recent data showed that Japan's real wages dropped by roughly 2% in the latest reporting period, marking yet another year where people effectively became poorer, even if their salaries on paper stayed about the same. This hits every household in a very real way. Food, rent, electricity, transportation, insurance, practically everything costs more than it did just a year before. But when your income barely budges, you feel the squeeze immediately. You stop going out. You postpone buying things. You cut back on anything that feels non-essential. The problem is structural. Japanese companies have a long history of being conservative about wage increases. Even when inflation jumped higher, many businesses delayed raises or offered token increases that didn't come close to offsetting rising prices. And with economic growth stuck near zero, companies feel little pressure to compete for labor with higher pay. Instead, they hold back, hoping to ride out uncertain conditions. Younger workers feel this the hardest. Many of them are in contract or part-time positions with lower pay and unstable hours. They entered the workforce during a sluggish economic era, and inflation hit before they had time to build savings. When real wages fall, they have no buffer. Every yen counts, and every price increase hurts. Older workers aren't immune either. Their savings and pensions don't stretch as far when inflation chips away at their buying power. Falling real wages also damage the economy from the inside. When consumers tighten spending, businesses earn less. When businesses earn less, they invest less and hire less. That feeds right back into weaker wage growth, creating a cycle that slowly grinds the economy down. And beyond the numbers, there's a psychological shift happening. People lose confidence. They stop believing the future will be better than the past. They hold on to their money because they don't trust the system. When a nation's consumers feel that way, growth becomes almost impossible. Japan's real wage crisis isn't just about shrinking paychecks. It's a sign that the economy is failing to create opportunity, stability, and upward mobility. And until real wages start rising faster than prices, Japan's economic struggles are only going to deepen. One of the most telling signs of Japan's economic decline is how young people are walking away from goals that used to define adulthood. Owning a home, building a stable career, and planning a long-term life path. These were once considered normal steps. Today, for millions of young Japanese, they feel like fantasies. Start with homeownership. Housing prices in major cities like Tokyo, Yokohama, and Osaka have surged far beyond what young workers can realistically afford. Even a small apartment can cost tens of millions of yen, and the down payment alone is enough to financially crush someone earning an entry-level salary. Meanwhile, wages haven't kept pace at all, so young people run the numbers and quickly realize home ownership simply doesn't make sense anymore. Many have already accepted that they will rent for life. Then there's the collapse of stable careers. Japan's old system of lifetime employment, the idea that you join a company in your early 20s and stay until retirement, is fading fast. Companies rely more heavily on temporary, part-time, or contract workers. These roles pay less, offer fewer benefits, and provide almost no security. Over 35% of young workers are now in non-regular jobs, and that number keeps rising. Without stable incomes, long-term planning becomes almost impossible. You can't commit to a mortgage, start a family, or even save confidently when you have no idea what your income will look like next year. Layer in the demographic crisis, slow economic growth, rising living costs, and weak wage growth, and you get an entire generation that feels boxed in. Many young Japanese now avoid traditional career paths altogether. Some pursue gig-style work. Others live extremely frugal lifestyles because they don't see a financial future worth reaching for. The psychological burden is heavy. When the economic structure doesn't support your ambitions, you eventually stop having them. This shift isn't just a young people problem. When a whole generation stops investing in homes, careers, and families, the national economy weakens dramatically. Housing demand drops, productivity stagnates, birth rates fall even further. Consumer spending shrinks, and the cycle of economic stagnation tightens. Japan's young people aren't giving up because they're lazy or unmotivated. They're giving up because the math doesn't work. The opportunities their parents had simply don't exist anymore. And until the economy changes in a real, structural way, more and more young Japanese will choose survival over stability and short-term coping over long-term planning. Because right now, that's the only option the system gives them. Japan built its economic identity on exports. Cars, electronics, machinery, high-precision equipment, all shipped around the world. For decades, global demand was Japan's engine. But now that engine is sputtering. The global economy has slowed, key trading partners are struggling, and Japan's export power is taking hit after hit. The biggest problem is weakening demand from major buyers. China, which used to be one of Japan's strongest export markets, has slowed dramatically. Its own economic problems, real estate crashes, unemployment, weak consumer confidence, mean it's buying far fewer Japanese goods. Exports to China have dropped sharply, and that alone is a major blow because China is one of Japan's top trading partners. The United States and Europe aren't doing Japan many favors either. High interest rates, inflation, and slower economic activity have pushed consumers and companies to cut back on big purchases. When foreign buyers reduce spending on cars, electronics, and industrial equipment, Japan feels it immediately. These aren't niche products. They are the backbone of Japan's manufacturing sector. And when global demand falls, factories slow down, profits shrink, and workers face uncertainty. There's also fiercer competition than ever before. South Korea, Taiwan, China, and even emerging economies are producing cheaper, faster, and in some cases better alternatives. Japan used to dominate areas like consumer electronics, but over the years, those markets shifted overseas. Now even sectors Japan still excels in, like high-end manufacturing and automotive, face pressure from global competition and changing demands. On top of everything else, a weaker global trade environment means supply chains stay unstable, shipping costs fluctuate, and companies hesitate to invest. All of this directly hits Japan's export-dependent economy. When exports weaken, Japan loses one of its last reliable drivers of growth. And in a country already dealing with low domestic consumption, falling real wages, and a shrinking workforce, losing export strength is like losing the final pillar holding up the economy. Japan's economic problems aren't random, and they're definitely not temporary. When you step back and look at the full picture, The shrinking workforce, the exploding debt, the falling real wages, the hopelessness among young people, and the weakening export engine, you start to see a country running out of room to maneuver. These issues feed into each other, creating a cycle that Japan has been stuck in for decades. Only now the cracks are wider and the pressure is heavier. The brutal truth is that Japan isn't just facing one crisis, it's facing several at the same time. And the weight of all of them together is dragging the economy down faster than most people want to admit. But understanding what's really going on is the first step to seeing the bigger picture, and maybe even the future of other aging, slow-growth economies around the world. Thanks for sticking with me through this breakdown, and I'll catch you in the next one.